Hey, it's Michael here, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a view filter using the Revit API and C#. Now we're going to go through a 7-step process, and that's going to include defining the categories, creating the rules, creating the filter itself, and then applying the filter to a view with some graphic overrides. All right, so it's going to be a lot of good stuff here. Let's switch on over into Visual Studio and get started. So I'm here in Visual Studio and I'm in my command file, and what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to rough out what steps we're going to take to build this add-in. So our first step is we're going to get the active view. So once we do that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a list of categories, and these are the categories that are going to be used specifically for the filter. Now once we have those categories, we can go ahead and we can create our rules. Now with those rules in hand, next step is to go ahead and create our LogicalAnd filter. So we're going to create a LogicalAnd filter first, and then we'll take a look at a variation where we create a LogicalOr filter. So we'll look at both of those types of filters. Now when we have our filter, we're going to create what's called a parameter filter, and we're actually going to use this to create the real filter, the filter that we want. But before we get to that step, we're going to set our graphic overrides, and these are what are going to be applied to the view when those particular rules are matched. And then the last thing we're going to do, last but not least, we're going to apply the filter, we're going to set the visibility, and then we're going to add in the overrides on top of that. All right, so let's get started here on step 1. And like I said, the first step, we're going to get the active view. And this is actually pretty straightforward. All we're going to do is we're going to reference our document variable, which is right up here, and that's our active UI document. And we're going to create a view variable, and we're just going to set that view variable equal to our document.activeView. Nice and easy. And once we've done that, what we can do is next create our list of categories. So I'm going to start that by creating a list of element IDs. I'm going to call that categories, and I'm just going to instantiate the list. So we're going to create an empty list of element IDs called categories. But once we have that in hand, what we can do is we can actually add categories to it. So in this instance, we're only going to be adding a single category, a wall category. But I'm going to reference the add method of categories, and I'm going to set that equal to a new element ID. And inside the argument field here for the element ID, I'm going to just pass in the built-in category OST_walls. So that's going to create an element ID specifically for that built-in category. If I wanted to add some additional categories, I would just add another category.add statement and then follow the same code here on line 32. And I would just change up and add for all the various different built-in categories I wanted to include in this filter. Again, we're just going to be looking at a single category, which is walls, but easy enough to add additional categories. Now our next step is we're going to create our rules, and we're going to create 2 rules here. Our first rule, I'm going to change this up a little bit. So our first rule, we're going to look for walls where the width is greater than or equal to, I'm going to say 200 meters, let's say 6 inches. Now one thing to note is when we create the rule, we're actually going to be using decimal feet values. But if you're using a metric model, you're still going to input things in decimal feet. Now the Revit API uses decimal feet as its base unit, so just keep that in mind. So to create this rule, first thing we need to do though is we need to get the parameter that we're looking for. Now I'm going to create an element ID variable, and I'm going to call it width param ID, and I'm going to set it equal to a new element ID, kind of like we did up here in line 32. But instead of referencing the built-in category, I'm going to reference a built-in parameter. And the particular parameter I'm looking for is called wall_ATR_width_param. Now, this isn't something I just remembered off the top of my head. I actually went into Revit and I used the Revit lookup tool in order to look up a wall, and then I went into the wall type and I found that parameter name. So when we go into Revit, I'll show you exactly how you can do that. But that allows me to reference that particular built-in parameter. Now that I have that parameter, I can actually go ahead and I can create the rule. So the rule is a filter rule. That is the data type. And I'm going to call this rule 1. And I set it equal to parameter filter rule factory dot create greater than or equal rule. So I'm going to put this on 2 lines just so it's a little easier to read. So I'm creating a greater or equal rule. The parameter it's going to look at is my width parameter ID up above. Then I input my value. So the greater than or equal to 0.5. So that is the parameter value that I'm setting. And then the last part of this in that rule is whether that there's an epsilon value. Values less than the user supplied value but within epsilon are considered equal. So this gives me a little bit of tolerance. So I wanted to look at exactly 6 inches. So I'm not going to add any tolerance. I'm going to set that here to 0. Now another thing to note when you're creating these parameter filter rules is that the value that you input here has to match the value of the parameter. So I've seen instances where, if I wanted to look up 1, or I wanted to look at a wall that was greater than or equal to 1 foot, I would need to actually set this to be 1.0 because the data type for that parameter is a double. So it has a decimal value. If I entered just 1, then Revit would think that I was actually just entering an integer. So something to keep in mind. Now, for us, it's okay. We're just going 0.5, so that should work out fine. Now, we're going to create another rule here as well. So we're going to look at 2 different rules. Let's give myself a little bit of space. And so for our rule 2, we're going to look for walls where the wall function equals exterior. So we want walls that are greater than 6 inches and then walls that are considered exterior walls. So that's our second rule. This is going to be a slightly different type of rule, as you'll see in a second. Again, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that parameter value, or the parameter element ID. So I create a element ID variable called exterior param ID, and I set that equal to new element ID. We're going to reference that built-in parameter function underscore param. And again, I don't carry that information around in my head. I went in and I used Revit lookup, and I found inside of the wall, I found that particular parameter, and then I got the built-in parameter name for it. So once we have that, now we can go ahead and create our rule. So let's put this on 2 lines again, make it easier on ourselves. So our rule number 2, again, is another filter rule, and we're going to use the parameter filter rule factory, and in particular, the create equals rule. So up above, we use the create greater or equal rule. In this particular rule, we're going to use create equals rule. Now, we're going to check and see if that function, the wall function, is equal to wall function dot exterior. So the wall function parameter uses an integer value here, and I can choose the different wall functions. So if I wanted to get interior wall function dot, I can choose interior, exterior, retaining, foundation, any of those different wall types. So I'm going to set that for exterior. And I do have to do a cast. I actually have to cast this to be an integer because this particular parameter uses an integer value to identify what is that function of the wall. All that stuff, again, I just kind of parse it out by using Revit lookup to look at that parameter inside an actual wall. All right, so we have our list of categories, we have our active view, we have our 2 rules. What we're going to go ahead and do next is we're going to create our LogicalAnd filter. So we have to first create an element parameter filter using our rule. So we're going to create a variable of the element parameter filter type. We'll call it filter 1. And I'm going to set it equal to a new element parameter filter. And I'm going to pass in our rule 1. So I'm creating an instance of the element parameter filter class that has rule 1 as part of it. We're going to do the same thing for rule 2. So I create filter 2, and that's equal to new element parameter filter, and then I use rule 2 as the argument. So once I have those 2 element parameter filters, now I can go ahead and I can create our LogicalAnd filter. So I'm going to call this variable an elem filter, and this is of the LogicalAnd filter class. And I'm going to set that equal to a new LogicalAnd filter. And we're going to pass in filter 1 and filter 2. Now, I mentioned in the intro, we're going to look at how to do a LogicalOr filter. You'll see it's very similar to here, but we'll do that once we get through and test this out. Okay, so we are going to be making a change in the model. We're adding something to the model. So we're going to need to go ahead and create a transaction. So I'm going to create a transaction. I'm going to use a using statement, and inside, so that means that inside the transaction is only going to persist within the boundaries of that using statement. So I have my transaction T equals new transaction. I'm going to pass in my document, and then we're going to call this transaction create and apply filter. Now, once we have that transaction created, I'm going to start it. And now let's take all of these next remaining steps, 5, 6, and 7. These are going to be inside of our transaction. So we're going to create next our parameter filter. And with our parameter filter, we are going to, we'll break this up into 2 lines here. 1 second. Okay, so our parameter filter, we'll call it param filter. And we're going to use the parameter filter element.create method to create the parameter filters. And you'll notice we're creating a lot of stuff here. We had to create rules. We had to create element parameter filters. We did our LogicalAnd filter. So we're slowly building up to this point where we actually go ahead and create the filter itself. So for this step, we're creating the parameter filter element. It's called param filter. We're using the parameter filter element.create method. We have to pass in, as part of this method, we pass in a document. We give that filter a name, exterior wall thickness, and this is what we'll see inside of Revit. And then we pass in those categories. Now, with this, now that we have the filter, what we can do is we can actually set the element filter. So we're going to reference our variable param element filter, and then we're going to use the set element filter method, and then we're going to go ahead and then pass in our LogicalAnd filter right here. So first step that we did for this step, step 5, we create the parameter filter element, and then we set the element filter. So now we actually have the filter itself, and if we were to run this code, we'd see that that filter would pop up in our view filter dialog. But we're not done, not yet. So next we want to go ahead and we want to create our graphic overrides. So when we identify walls that are greater than 6 inches and are exterior, we want to highlight them in some way. So in step 6, we're going to set those overrides. We're going to do 2 things. First, we're going to create a graphic override setting object. I'll call it overrides. And I'm going to instantiate that just by using new keyword, new override graphic settings. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and we can set those settings themselves. We have a lot of options here. And now for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to set the cut line color because we're going to be looking at walls. We're going to be looking at walls in the floor plan. So we're going to set that line color, and I'm going to set it equal to red. If I wanted to, though, if I go to overrides, and you'll see I have a lot of different properties I could set. I could set the cut background pattern, the foreground pattern ID, the line color, line weight, all those things. In fact, let's go ahead. We could let's set our cut line weight right here. Let's see if we can set that. And I can just put in an integer value. So I'll set that equal to 5 just to pop it out a little bit more. And we'll see if that's enough. Then we can make some adjustments. Okay, so those are our graphic override settings. So anything that goes through this view filter and passes and is sort of identified as being greater than 6 inches and being exterior, we're going to apply these overrides to them graphically in that particular view. So now we're on the home stretch. We've got our filter, we've got our overrides. What we're going to do next is we're going to apply the filter to the view, set its visibility, and then apply those overrides. So we're going to first add our filter to the view. So we're going to use the view, inside of the view class, there is a method called add filters. So we're going to reference our view, which is all the way set here, in step 1. So that is going to be our active view. So we're going to say view.addFilter. We're going to add our param filter, and then we actually just add the ID to the param filter. That's the argument here for that method is the element ID. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and we can set that filter visibility. So we want this filter or the elements that pass the filter to be visible, so we can set that equal to true. If I wanted to hide those elements, I would just set this value here. I would set that equal to false. And we'll take a look at that too when we run it. Next, and really last step, we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply the graphic overrides. So I'm going to use set filter overrides method. I'm going to pass in my parameter filter ID, and then I'm going to take our overrides up here and use those to set the overrides. All right, so that's pretty much it. The only thing I need to do as a last step is I need to just commit my changes. So I'm going to use T for my transaction, T.commit, and we should be good to go. Now let me take a look. It looks like everything looks okay. I just need to bring this over here, and I'm going to just change this. I'm going to run this in Revit 2023. So I'm going to hit start. We'll test our code, see how it works. So I'm here in my Revit sample file, and I'm going to go up to add-ins, external tools, and we're going to look for our add-in here. Here we go, command 1, and I'm going to give it a run. And you can see it's going through, it's doing something, it's creating some stuff, and it applies the actual filter. So if I zoom in, I can see that exterior walls that are greater than 6 inches are going to show up as red. I had set those properties right there. Now if I check on my visibility settings here and I go into filters, I can see that that's the name of the filter that I created, exterior wall thickness. I can see my overrides right there. And if I go to edit new, I can see here's the filter I created. Here is the LogicalAnd rule. There's my width, there's my function. You can see it did convert that width to a metric value. So I am in a metric model, even though I specified inside of Visual Studio, I specified that to be 6 inches. Revit did that conversion for the units. So it will make that conversion. So I do have to specify it in decimal feet, but then it will convert to the model units. So everything looked good, everything worked great. I'm going to hit cancel. Let me cancel this. I'm going to undo this, and we'll jump back into Visual Studio and make a few changes just so we can see how that affects our filter. I'm going to go back in, and inside of my code here, we had set our filter visibility in line 64. We had set that to true, but what happens if we change that to false? I'm going to hit hot reload. We'll switch back into Revit, and we'll give it a run. So it's going to take a minute to generate all of that. But what happened now, because we set that visibility to false, any of those elements, instead of changing their color, it actually just turned them off. So they're no longer visible. If we go back into our visibility settings, we go into filters, I can see that visibility is unchecked based on that false value. If I hit OK, I changed it to be visible, and I should see it show up and with those graphic overrides in place. Now I'm going to hit, let me go to zoom, I'm going to just zoom to fit, and we'll take a look at, we can see kind of roughly where those exterior walls greater than and that are greater than 6 inches are. I'm going to undo, and now let's go back and switch this to, instead of a LogicalAnd filter, let's switch to a LogicalOr filter. So in Visual Studio, I'm going to go up to here where we created our filter rules, and what we're going to do is we're going to create our logical filter rules. So I'm going to just let me paste this down here, and let's drop this in here as well. So we created our, I'm going to comment out, sorry, on line 47, our LogicalAnd filter, and we're going to instead apply our LogicalOr filter. And it's pretty much the same configuration, this similar code we used in line 47, except our data type here is a LogicalOr filter. I'm going to call it LM. I'll change it back to LM filter so we don't have to change anything downstream. But now we have that LogicalOr filter. So this means if either rule applies to an element, then it is going to pass the filter, and we're going to see that change. So I'm going to do a hot reload, switch into Revit. So what we should see happen is we should actually see a lot more views. So let me undo back to our original state here. We should see a lot more walls kind of passing through that filter. So they can either be 6 inches or they can be exterior walls. So give that a run. It's going to do its thing. And, oh, you know what? I forgot. Let me undo that again. What happened is I actually had it set to false. So our visibility was still set to false. Let me change that right down here. Okay. So I want our visibility to be set to true. There we go. Reload that. And let's give it one more try. Okay, so again, we're going to see a lot more walls kind of pass through that filter, and lo and behold, they do. So we're actually capturing now that curtain wall along the exterior, pretty much all around the building. We're seeing some interior walls in here as well. So again, with that LogicalOr filter, it's a little bit more permissive in terms of what gets filtered. All right, so that is how we create view filters using the Revit API. This was a quick look at how to do it, but definitely play around and look at some of the options that you have available to you in the Revit API. There's a lot of options, and so you can really fine-tune exactly how you want to filter your views. But you code it once, you run it, and it works great. All right? Give it a try. Let me know what you think.